Huge deep breath and try and relax. Accessibility is not a light switch that you can turn on and it's done. This is an ever evolving process.
All right, Matt Donovan here with another installation of Insights and Innovation, and we've got two fantastic guests today. We're going to be talking on the concept of accessibility, but not just traditional concepts around accessibility. It's really about developing an inclusive mindset and why it's so critical when you think about trying to take advantage of your entire workforce to really incorporate them in the needs of the future, the workforce of the future. It's going to be critical to really think about that inclusive mindset around the concept of accessibility. So I got two fantastic folks here working with this at GP Strategies. I'll give them a second here to introduce themselves. So Katherine, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Katie.
Sure. So my name is Katherine Hill. I'm an instructional designer at GP Strategies. I'm a certified professional in accessibility core competencies, certified through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. So a lot of letters there, but really it just means I'm passionate about this topic, and I'm really excited to be here.
Glad to have you here. Katie?
Hi, my name is Katie Radloff. I am a senior editor at GP Strategies. I've been here for a little over 8 years working on one of our accounts that is particularly passionate about accessibility and have been helping other accounts move accessibility forward as well.
Yeah, so this is not something that you just do or talk about randomly. You are working with this pretty much on a daily basis. The considerations in the design, the creation of learningware, so to speak, out there. So this is something you guys have been doing, and obviously been doing a lot of research and certified in that space. So it's fantastic. Before we get in and talk about the accessibility in the workforce, I wanted to, you were sharing some really interesting statistics about, and I've seen a couple myself. For example, it was estimated, I think, on a McKinsey article that as much as 30 to 35% of what we know as the workforce would self-identify as having a needs for accessibility support. But I would love to hear some other statistics that you guys share. So how prevalent is this an issue, or why is this something we really need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so I can start on that one. It's hard to pin down statistics when it comes to accessibility. Not everybody is comfortable identifying yet. There's still some stigma associated with it, unfortunately. So that you're going to see different statistics depending on the survey and who's asking. According to the World Health Organization, there's over 1 billion people around the world that have identified as having a disability. In the United States, we have about 61 million adults. So that's 26%, or 1 in 4.
What's interesting about that is that with current studies, almost a quarter of college students entering freshmen this year are self-identifying as having a disability. So we can see a little bit that the stigma is moving away, and we have to prepare for, in 4 years, these kids will be in our workforce.
So obviously with those kind of numbers in the population, either, as you said, it's kind of hard to identify whether or not, how well are they being acknowledged or identified in the workforce, but it's a significant portion. So let's talk a little bit about defining accessibility, because I know that it's been evolving. What is it? What does it include? Can we come up with a kind of common, or I would say an emerging definition that we can have from a shared understanding?
Start with, what is a disability?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is vastly misunderstood in the population. If you are wearing glasses, you are using an accessible technology. It is helping you see because you have a deficit in your sight. And that's one of the reasons why the number is so high. And that's one of the visible disabilities. We also have the invisible disabilities, things like ADHD and dyslexia, PTSD, things like that are completely unseen to the population. So when you bring all these things together, basically it means you have some issue that is keeping you from doing everyday things in the way that other people would. And to design accessibility around that is a huge challenge.
something that COVID-19 has brought to light a lot in terms of accessibility and disability is situational disabilities, right? So maybe you don't identify as having a disability, but you have specific things that are happening around you that are having an impairment on how you're doing your work or how you're interacting with life, right? So some of us may have children running around that are causing extra distractions, or maybe we have poor internet connections working from home. So those images and those documents that we're trying to send through aren't loading. And without alternative text attached to those, I'm not getting access to that information anymore because of my internet. So not an identified disability in traditional terms, but still something important to consider.
So you're really expanding the definition that to include barriers between the learner or performer and the information, being able to access the information they need in order to learn or do their job, to be able to do that. So that's expanding that definition. And I think taking such a broad definition, being able to bring that into our designs is absolutely critical. So how does that kind of, come across in challenges that organizations are facing? So what are some examples that this definition of disability can impact? What are some impact in the learning space?
Well, it's a lot to think about, right? We just touched on a lot of topics all at once. So sometimes it can be overwhelming on where to start, but it's also really important. It's basically your ultimate learner-centered approach, right? So you really have to think about all of your learners, all of your workforce, and what do they really need? We're all adults. Let's put everything into our hands. Let's give us control of access to information the way that we want it, is really the bottom line.
And to a large extent, audience analysis is really important in the learning space. We have some clients where we're working in, say, a manufacturing field, where you can say they have to lift 20 pounds, they have to have vision, they have to be able to grip. You understand exactly what physical capabilities they have to do to complete the work. So that limits what accessibility options you have to provide. In other industries, like say the technology industry, for example, you have no idea who the person on the opposite end of the learning, what kind of challenges they're facing. So in that instance, you have to make sure everything is available to them.
No, I like that. So the first step you're really saying is we first need to become aware of who is our population, what are the challenges, what are the barriers they may have, and in that continuum of that progressively tight definition of a disability or what may need support around an accessibility challenge. Which it starts off. I love that you start off with that learner analysis to understand your population, which is difficult. As we kind of went back to the statistics you already mentioned, it's really kind of hard to get a firm grasp on those numbers. So I'm imagining organizations do need to work harder to kind of identify their population that may need to do that. But sometimes individuals don't want to self-identify as part of that population. So I think it's not only being able to take a look at internally and saying, what are we hearing from our population, but also looking at externally at industry and global standards as to what we're seeing in the broader population to see, to get a guidance between two. Is that a reasonable strategy or approach?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because there are a lot of people that are never going to self-identify. It's their personality. They want to keep those pieces of information private. And then you have other people who are freely sharing of what their challenges are and ask for the accommodations they need immediately. So there's sort of a whole gamut of where people fall on the spectrum of how much they're willing to share.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of organizations, in order to work within that, is including inclusive design or accessible design or accessibility in general in their DE&I for their companies, right? So it's become another pillar that it incorporates all that diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And I like how you tie that back to, because it's not accessibility as a separate item. It's tying into diversity, equity, and inclusion. Part of that inclusion is creating an accessible work environment and setting aside, some of the elements of the hybrid where you talk about, physical, remote, virtual, some of that accessibility. Set that aside. We'll talk a little bit about that differently. But I think just even be able to understand the population around that from an inclusive standpoint is really critical. So this isn't just about transcripts and, being able to have transcripts and then on video to be able to have the subtitles available. It goes deeper than that.
Absolutely. If you've ever turned on a screen reader and just seen how difficult it is to interact with a screen that's not set up for a screen reader, you have an acute awareness of how smart people are and have to be if they're working with some sort of disability and are continually having to climb these mountains of challenges. These are smart people that we can take that intelligence and creativity and put that to work for us in better, more productive ways.
Yeah, and we're talking about 26%, right? That's a big percentage of your workforce that is having to work harder to accomplish the same goal.
Yeah, and knowing that, with the upskilling challenges that we're facing in the future, being able to tap in to 100% of your workforce is going to give you better, a business capability to address those upskilling challenges, rather than automatically 26% having a barrier to even be able to help grow to fit that need. I do want to turn a little bit. So let's talk a little bit. I know we could actually do full day seminars on the topic, but as you're thinking around, what are some of the best practices that you see that some of our partners and clients are putting in place as they're starting to go into this? Because my understanding is that each organization needs to kind of decide and understand its approach, its strategy, how they're going to address the needs of their community. But what are some of the just in general best practices they're putting out there?
Yeah, and I think we have to start that conversation by recognizing the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So there's a number of different versions. We're kind of up to 2.1 with 2.2 in draft right now. But this is really the web standards, and they are like guidelines is in the title. So they are interpreted differently by different organizations, by different people with disabilities even. So it can be fluid, which is one of the challenges for many of the organizations like just starting out on their accessible design journeys right now, right? So it's really important to root in those standards, but also adapt as related to your organization.
You also have to keep in mind things like regionality. Canada has some very specific rules. The United States has revised Section 508. There are other countries and other areas regions of the world that have additional accessibility rules as well. So you have to keep in your regional laws in mind as well.
So it's got global standards, you've got regional standards, requirements you may have, and then in addition to that, you may have, depending on what the organization is trying to achieve or the way it engages its workforce, some special or unique needs. I like how you call out that it's guidelines, because it's not a detailed checklist book that applies for everybody. There has to be thought in how are you going to execute it, what you're trying to do from a learning impact or an outcome, the different ways you're engaging folks, and thinking up ways to be able to make it more accessible overall. I love that. So Anna, you mentioned the WCAG guidelines. I think you said WCAG, but they were talking about coming up with a new update here pretty soon, going from 2.1 to 2.2. So they're going to release even more with that. So these guidelines are being updated regularly. I think the last update was that early last year. When was the last update?
So 2.2 was supposed to come out early last year. It was delayed because early this year, I guess I should say, because of COVID. So it has been pushed a few times. And the big challenge that they're trying to address in that 2.2 really focuses on cognitive disabilities. So it's really hard to put a qualitative or quantitative checklist to something like a cognitive disability. So disabilities are, someone with the same disability may need something completely different than the other person. And that's even more so when it comes to cognitive disabilities.
And there's not a one size fits all that we found with every organization. They've had to go through the process, and we've been able to partner with them to help identify some strategies around that, remain relevant with that. And it's not just around the e-learning that they're rolling out. I know a lot of folks sometimes think about, well, I have to think about my e-learning, but do I have to have considerations around my face-to-face training as well, or my live and synchronous? Are there other considerations beyond just the e side?
Yes. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG, were actually designed for websites. So we're now taking that and trying to layer it onto the other tools we use for e-learning. So that's kind of where that guidelines comes in again, where we're taking a standard and applying it to something it wasn't really intended for. But for sure, you have to consider everything from environment and access. Maybe someone that's coming to your training session is in a wheelchair. Can they get to the room that you've booked for that training? Someone that's visually impaired sitting in the back of your room, them listening to your presentation, can they see your presentation? Have you provided it to them so they can access it in a different way?
And things like for our instructor-led courses, when you provide your resources afterwards, provide a deck that is an accessible deck. Provide the resources afterwards, make sure that they're accessible. And in some cases, what people are doing is for courses where when people are registering, they're asking people to self-identify and ask what they need. Do you need an interpreter? Do you need to see the resources ahead of time? And providing them ahead of time so that those people can familiarize themselves with the content, get through what they need to get through so they can focus on the speaker when they're actually in the room with them.
I love that. It's not just what you're providing, it's when you're providing it, time when they're going to be coming into this. Because it's not just the individual go through an experience by yourself, but if I'm participating with a group, a cohort of individuals, or something else that's a live component, having that prep is critical. Love that.
I was just going to say that's something that it comes up as a challenge for me sometimes when working with facilitators, convincing them to release their decks ahead of time. People don't like to do that. It's like, well, why would someone come into my presentation if they already have seen the materials? And you see that in the academic world too, in colleges and universities, right? But you really need to put the control in the learner's hands, right? So your learners, your workforce, they're here to do a job. They're here to learn. Let them do that. Why do you need to be in control of that?
Yeah, and I think there are ways to be able to get to that. So you can allow scaffolding to take place, but maybe it's not, I don't turn over my entire slide deck just as is. Is there a primer? Is there a structure to scaffold that gives me more advanced notice? What am I going to be covering? How can I work through some of those concepts? You don't have to turn absolutely everything over, but to your point, giving them an idea to think about how they prepare for it is a great idea. We know that's important, but you don't have to give everything away, but give them at least a fighting chance to be able to participate.
Well, and what we're finding is when we do it that way, the audience is more engaged. They've had time to mull over and think about how it applies to their daily life, their daily work, and they come with really pointed questions that really challenge our facilitators. And then you have a better session overall.
Doing something like that doesn't just help that percentage of your population that might have a disability. It's really helping everybody. When it comes down to accessibility, and it's something I say all the time, but accessible and inclusive design is really just good design. It helps everybody.
I love that. I love that, being able to come back with that. So let's take that a little bit deeper. When we think about the entire experience, so it's not just, and we've been moving to a lot more towards what I would call learning journeys and learning experiences, not just discrete learning pieces. And so when you think about, the accessibility, it's a thread that should run through the entire journey, not just the pieces itself. So you're trying to create the overall experience is that have a consistent tone and focus on accessibility versus just this piece was, well, the videos are all accessible because they're really easy to do, but then I get to the face-to-face and it really had no consideration. How do you kind of keep that experiential design all the way through to be inclusive in that mindset?
Yeah, and that takes a lot of collaboration, especially with our clients. So if we design something that is the most amazing thing we've ever designed, we package it up, we send it to our client, and then they post it on an LMS that's not accessible, then it completely defeats the purpose, right? So you need to make sure that you're working together. And more often than not, that's a lot of conversations. A lot of our clients are really new to this accessible journey themselves. So we need to be the experts. We need to help guide them in those conversations to make sure there aren't barriers for what we're designing.
And accessible design in and of itself is very collaborative. The instructional designers, the editors, the testers, our content developers, everybody has to be having conversations all the way through the design and journey because things pop up without you realizing it. Oh, we didn't think of this. How do we, this platform has this challenge. How do we address it? What's the workaround? Or do we need to switch platforms? There's just a lot of conversation all the way through the journey. And that's a lot of consultative decision making with our clients. When we reach one of those challenges, we have to go back to the client and say, okay, this is the challenge. We have A, B, and C as our directions that we can take. Which do you think is going to work best and which will meet your needs in the best way?
And I've seen such positives coming from our clients when we work in that way, even outside of inclusive design again, right? You're building that relationship with the client. You're establishing those roles. You're working together, which is just usually a more positive experience for everybody anyway.
I mean, you mentioned, can you kind of, tell a quick story to kind of bring it to life of a really great partnership that created a great output from an accessibility and inclusive mindset?
We just had one just yesterday, in fact. We are creating a participant workbook in OneNote, and we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. And part of that is the font size that you choose for everything. And when we were getting in and trying to develop it, OneNote will allow you to change the font size for normal text, but not the headings. So the headings were staying small, and the normal text was is larger like we wanted it to. And ultimately the decision for now was to leave it as is, because the Zoom function is available. Yeah. So we wrote a disclaimer at the top saying, if you have visual impairments, please use the Zoom feature. But then we also created a support ticket on with Microsoft and had a conversation with them yesterday. And accessibility is so important to them that they realized it and they're pushing it forward to their developers. And we may see that change in the near future.
Love that. So not only you're not only having this experience, but you're sharing it up the chain. I love to see that. That's great. Well, and you were also sharing an experience of something you were going to take in personally to kind of go and learn. And you had a really positive, I think, engagement exercise when they were asking you, what did you need? Tell a little bit more about that for the session you were signing up for.
I'm signing up for a session on how to create more inclusive videos. And this is and just on a regular registration page. And this is the first time I've ever seen it, and I was so excited. One of the questions it asked us is, what accessible accommodations do you need? Do you need an ASL interpreter? Do you need someone to take notes for you? Do you need us to provide you a recording of the session? I think there were 8 to 10 items that they were asking people to self-identify so that they could ensure that the people who needed them had the information in their hands. And I just love seeing that.
No, I agree. I love that story. I think that's fantastic. It's really about, ironically, it's on point for the topic at hand. Love to be able to align with the message. So if I kind of come back, and I've heard some really great things from you, and I do want to get a last takeaway, but before I go kind of react to, I got 4 things here that I think are great takeaways that anybody could start working on. One of them is, when you're working with organizations and partners, start to have a plan. What is going to be your approach to accessibility? What are the considerations? There are great resources. This is something that we've helped with folks, but start off with have a plan. Overall, how is the organization going to approach it? How are you tying into it? That's number 1. Number 2 is really start with your learner. When you get down to the design point, it begins with your learner population. Learn as much as you can about them. What are their needs? And straight up ask them is probably the easiest way to get started, but also do your research. I think that's number 2. So understand. Number 3, you really brought out was understand the technology that's going to be involved. So there are a variety of ways to deliver content, to gather interactions, to provide feedback. Know the strengths and limitations of the technology. You talked about font size and OneNote and a challenge with that. That's a perfect example that you can have a great plan, but the technology may not be exactly in set up to be able to do that. So know what you're working with around that one. And then the last one I know is kind of come back and measure. Make sure you're hitting the mark with this. Don't just assume that you've delivered. Be open that there are things in the design that I don't think you found with that. So I kind of called out those are 4 big ones. You guys feel free to modify or challenge me on any of those.
The one that I always say in meetings is take a huge deep breath and try and relax. Accessibility is not a light switch that you can turn on and it's done. This is an ever evolving process, and every baby step you take towards moving towards more accessible documents and deliverables and websites is something you didn't have before. So just keep moving in the right direction.
I love that. I love that. Katherine?
Yeah, my big takeaway is always, it goes back to the same slogan. It's not a chore. It's not a checklist. It's really just doing what's right. We're not doing this just because we're told we have to, or because a specific organization has set standards. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. Really think about your why. Why are you doing this? Because 26% of your population is not a small number. That's why you're doing this.
And there's a lot that can be done with absolutely no investment. There are a lot of these guidelines are just simple shifts in how you write and how you implement things that require absolutely no financial investment, just a small investment in time.
No, I like that. I think that there's an incentive to do something, start somewhere, a single step in the direction. You don't have to solve the entire huge issue all at once. It can sometimes seem a little daunting, but there's clearly some things that you can start to do tomorrow in your designs to move it forward with that. I love that. Well, I tell you, it's a very important topic, and I love what you guys are doing. You're clearly passionate about it. I look forward to kind of having you guys back and bringing hopefully some more great stories of partnerships and outcomes around the accessibility journey. But I appreciate you having on here. Any final thoughts or comments you guys like to share?
I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm excited to continue the conversation. So just talk accessibility to anybody and everyone that you come across. Keep spreading the word.
Absolutely. In large part, this is a grassroots effort. So everybody who can bring it up to anybody, it's going to take us more forward towards making sure that everybody can have the information they need.